Ibn Tumar died in 1130, and his death was kept secret for like almost 2.5 years, most likely from a desperate power struggle that developed. But in 1132, a new leader took control. Abu Muhammad Abd al-Mumin took power in 1132. He immediately stepped up the offensive, but for the next 8 years it was going to be still a stalemate. The Almoravids couldn't penetrate into the high mountains, and the Almohad didn't have the manpower to challenge the former in the open plains. When Abd Mumin attempted this, initially at least, he got his forces destroyed. But eventually he got a break as the Almoravids needed to focus on other uprisings, rebellions, and a sagging front in the Iberian Peninsula. Abd Mumin wasted no time and ruthlessly pursued the offensive. He secured areas within the High Atlas, the Middle Atlas, and then the Rif Mountains. But the real game changer was when he was able to finally break out from the mountainous strongholds, and then the war accelerated quickly. Now, once they got the initiative, it seemed like the Almohad got one lucky break after another. At the Battle of Oran in 1145, the Almoravid emir Tashfin ibn Ali was killed. At this point, the Almohad began to really strike forward. In 1146, they managed to take the cities of Fez and Meknes. And then Abd al-Mumin focused his attack on the Almoravid capital of Marrakesh, which in the very next year he managed to conquer. It was said that after he took control of the city, and again very much like Stalin, he put the Almoravid high command to the sword. And then, get a load of this, the very next year he conducted a purge of any, quote, unreliable administrator or military commander, and this purge numbered someplace in the neighborhood of like 30,000 people. The Almoravids were now kicked out of North Africa, but they persisted a little while longer in Al Andalus and the Balearic Islands. But it's kind of clear their days were very much numbered. Meanwhile, the Almohad would continue their expansion, fielding just massive armies. According to some sources, and this is most likely just an exaggeration, but even if this is half true, this new North African power could field armies up to 100,000 men. The Almohad used the next decade and a half to consolidate their hold on Morocco, but they did manage to venture east. In 1158, they managed to take Tunisia from the Normans who had invaded from Sicily, and in 1159 they managed to get to Tripoli in modern-day Libya. This would mark one of the high points of their expansion. Now, what about Hispania in all this? The story of the Almohad presence in Hispania was this frustrating story of lost opportunities or poorly concentrated effort. The stage was perfect for a foreign power to take over, and I think that if Abd al-Mumin and his successors had fully committed themselves, they could have, arguably at least, taken over the peninsula. But it always seemed like Spain was just a side project for him. So let me explain the situation. As the former Almoravids were being decimated by the local Andalusi, again the people of Al Andalus were not exactly happy with them and were rebelling left and right. A second Taifa period began with a bunch of warring city-states. It was a ripe opportunity for a takeover. As I've mentioned before, and to quote Lincoln, "A house divided cannot stand." Even before Marrakesh was taken by the Almohad, these city-states began to recognize the Almohad Caliph as a political entity. Some of these states that were really desperate decided to call to the Almohad for help. In the pattern that seems to keep repeating itself, in 1147 the Almohad began to land troops, and the next year, Seville, one of the major city-states, was in their hands. Seville, by the way, would go on to become their capital in Al Andalus. The Almohad continued their expansion, albeit slowly, until most of the southwestern portion of the peninsula was taken. Now the Christians in the north, who we'll get to in more detail later, entered into a period where they were having problems. They didn't have effective leadership. Let me give you a good example. Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, who was a fierce warrior and a forefront of the Reconquista, died in 1157. In the ill-conceived method that previous Castilian kings have used in the past, he decided to divide his powerful and, let me add, united kingdom amongst his two sons. One of them got Leon, the other one got Castile, and immediately they were at each other's throats, which only made the Almohad conquest easier. What's more, the Christian kingdoms were also divided when it came to their loyalties. Another good example was when the Portuguese were on the brink of taking the city of Badajoz. But the King of Leon decided to ally himself with the Almohad in order to keep him out. So let me ask you this, if you were a foreign power and you had a vast army at your disposal and you were to witness what was going on, wouldn't you want to take advantage of this? Wouldn't this be high on your list of opportunities to exploit? Now, the Almohad leadership did take some advantage of this. I personally wouldn't have given them an A for effort, but by the early 1160s they did own most of the southwestern and central portions of Al Andalus. But then their offensive began to really grind down, and ironically it wasn't a Christian that did it, but rather another Muslim. This man's name was Ibn Mardanus, and some of the books that I've read have him down as the King of Murcia. Now, it was his army and his knowledge of the land that kept the Almohad occupied for like the better part of a decade. So the Caliph finally got serious about his northern province, because the Almohad Empire was so big at this point that that's exactly what Al Andalus was for them. It was simply a province. The first thing that he did was to turn Gibraltar into a fortress palace. It was going to be his forward base to oversee his upcoming operation. Now, while this construction was going on, back in Morocco he decided to raise a just massive army. It was said to number 200,000 people. The baggage train alone was over 10 miles long. Again, likely just propaganda, but just as Abd al-Mumin was about to invade with this sledgehammer of a force, he died in 1163. Hugh Kennedy, in his book A Political History of Al Andalus, claims that the Caliph's death happened at just the right time. Indeed, the Caliph's death saved Al Andalus and the Christian kingdoms from being completely overrun. Abd al-Mumin was eventually succeeded by his son, a man named Abu Yaqub Yusuf. Hugh Kennedy has a really good insight on this new caliph. Quote, "The new caliph was an interesting personality. He was now only 25 years old, but not without political experience, having been the governor of Seville. His father had been a great leader of armies, but Yusuf did not inherit this quality. At crucial moments on campaign, he showed himself hesitant and indecisive, and this weakness was to prove fatal." End quote. You know what? I think you have to give this new caliph just a little bit of credit. He did, after all, start his reign with a new offensive in 1165. Granted, it didn't accomplish anything, but at least the new guy was trying. But his luck turned around in 1172 when Ibn Mardanus, who again was the King of Murcia, who had been holding up the Almohad offensive, died, and his lands were finally incorporated into the Almohad Caliphate. You would think that this would be a great chance for the young caliph to prove himself. In the wake of what was called a victory, which was really just the death of Ibn Mardanus and a quick land grab, the new caliph, Yusuf, finally opted to attack. He planned an expedition to take the city of Wotw, but he wasn't his father. He planned it extremely poorly. He marched in at the head of his army, and at a critical juncture he got word that the Christians under the King of Castile, now Alfonso VIII, were on their way. He lost his nerve and retreated. Kennedy picks up the tale, and I'm paraphrasing a little here. Quote, "The caliph's intention was to move on to Murcia to consolidate Almohad control over Ibn Mardanus's kingdom. The distances were not large, but the caliph had totally failed to take into account the provisioning of his large and unwieldy army on the desolate mountain roads in high summer. The journey turned into a sort of Almohad retreat from Moscow. On the first day of the march, the baggage train and the army became separated, and by the very next day both men and mules were dying of hunger." End quote. Now, this would become a recurring motif. You'd have a Muslim offensive, but then rebellions and uprisings began to occur in other parts of the vast Almohad Empire. And of course, when this happened, the caliph would have to leave Seville along with his army for the Maghreb. And in his absence, the Christians began to raid once again, so nobody really gained a decisive edge on either side. In 1184, the Caliph Yusuf led another force with the task of taking the city of Santarem. Again, it was poorly planned, and again it met with disaster. This time, the Caliph, when he was trying to retreat and regroup his men, found himself on the wrong side of a river with very little protection. A Christian vanguard managed to find him, attacked him, wounded him, and he soon died of these wounds. Like I said before, his indecisiveness would prove to be fatal. The next Almohad Caliph was a man named Abu Yusuf Yaqub. He named himself Al-Mansur. He came to power later that year, and the process repeated. The Caliph would try to subdue Hispania, but then would have to return to Marrakesh to reestablish his power base. It was kind of like a giant game of whack-a-mole. Now, it was during the rule of Al-Mansur that there was a massive uprising in the central Maghreb. I'm going to go to Hugh Kennedy, who puts this all into perspective. And Kennedy, by the way, is going through the lengths that Al-Mansur had to go through to deal with this uprising. Quote, "The subjugation of the North African rebels had been a long and hard campaign which had required all the resources of the Almohad state. It was not until 1190, 6 years after the defeat at Santarem and his own ascension, that Al-Mansur was able to turn his considerable military energies to the jihad in Al Andalus. These 6 years gave the Christians considerable opportunity for further expansion, and it was only the quarrels between the Christian powers that prevented them from taking advantage of the Caliph's absence to launch a major offensive." End quote. This was a stalemate. For example, in 1189, Portugal manages to take the city of Silves. The Almohad army arrives the next year, but it suffers yet again from poor logistics. To their credit, they were able to take the city back in 1191, but then they don't press the offensive. Instead, this relatively minor victory is hyped up with a bunch of propaganda. And then, as before, the Caliph has to return to North Africa to deal with more uprisings, and a truce is created between Christian and Muslim states. Now, this treaty, by the way, is not going to last for very long. In fact, just a few years later, in 1194, it goes away. It's at this point that Alfonso VIII of Castile decides to go on the offensive and starts attacking Almohad strongpoints, including the areas around their local capital, Seville, which you have to admit is pretty bold. On hearing of this renewed activity on the peninsula, the Caliph Al-Mansur brings his army back for a fight. On June 1st, 1195, he lands his troops at the port city of Tarifa. The Muslim army is then led forth on June 22nd to Seville, and then they move on to Cordoba, where they receive reinforcements by the local Andalusi. So by the numbers, he's got himself a pretty formidable force at this point, and he moves it up through the strategically important pass of Despeñaperros. For those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Spain, the Pass of Despeñaperros is a really steep canyon. It's one of the few passes through the Sierra Morena Mountains. If one wants to go from Andalusia in the south to the Meseta Central, which is the more central portion of Spain, you would most likely have to go through here. What can I say? The Romans knew it, the Carthaginians knew it, and now you know it. And this is exactly what Al-Mansur did. I mean, his plan was to invade the north. He took his army through the pass and arrived in the central plain in early July of 1195. Now, during this time, Alfonso VIII was getting more and more eager for a fight. He assembled his troops at Toledo and then marched them down to the city of Alarcos, which happened to be the southernmost portion of his kingdom. His plan was to bottle up the Muslim advance at the mouth of the pass. To the credit of our Castilian king, he was smart about this engagement. He called in reinforcements. Alfonso IX of Leon and Sancho VII of Navarre were on their way. So you would think that all he'd have to do is just kind of sit there and wait for his reinforcements to arrive. But then our Castilian king decided to go and do something really rash. Instead of waiting for these reinforcements to get there, he decided to the contrary that he could win the day all by himself. He didn't realize just how outnumbered he was. And so, on July 18th, the Battle of Alarcos began. Alfonso VIII was the type of sovereign who didn't want to mess around. He placed his troops in such a way that he could bring out his big guns and deliver the big punches right off the bat. So he placed his heavy cavalry right in the front, with his infantry directly behind him. The Almohad formation was a little bit more complicated. It was a reflection of all the different tribes that Al-Mansur had brought together to fight. His army consisted of 3 main lines. In the front, he had his infantry and archers of the Zenata tribe. In the middle, he placed his infantry of the Hintata, and in the back, he placed his elite Almohad troops. He also had a contingent of Arab troops that he placed on his left flank, and his soldiers from Al Andalus he placed on his right. Alfonso VIII wasted no time. He seized the initiative and began the fight with a powerful frontal attack with his heavy cavalry. This charge slammed into the front Zenata line, destroying it, brushing them aside. His momentum now carried him into the second line, the Hintata, which he wiped out nearly to a man. Our Castilian king now even threw in his infantry reserve. If he was playing poker, he would be, as they say, all in at this point. The focus of this combined attack now turned to the left, where they collided with the soldiers of Al Andalus, who at first began to fall back. But then, they slowly managed to hold their ground. The battle became much more static at this point, and for 3 long hours in the midday sun, both sides slogged it out. But then the initiative began to shift. Seeing his opponent getting bogged down, Al-Mansur ordered his Arab troops on his other side to attack the newly exposed flank and rear of his enemy. And by doing so, the Caliph managed to nearly surround the entire Castilian army. He then sent in his elite Almohad into the fray, and they finished it. Alfonso VIII had to be literally dragged from the fight by his bodyguards. But as he made his exit, he had a chance to look back and watched as his army got destroyed. This was going to be a massive defeat for the Castilians. Al-Mansur would capture several castles in the area, and then just to prove a point, he would raid the Tagus Valley, including the lands around Toledo.